Good morning, everyone. My name is Clark Vanderbeeken. I'm a marketing manager here at Cantina. I want to welcome everyone to this morning's webinar. I see that we have a few more people joining, but we figured we'll get started to stay on schedule. So with me today is Ian Cox. He's a Senior Vice President of Delivery at Cantina. Good morning, Ian.
Good morning.
Our topic this morning is planning for design. Ian is going to discuss the foundational project practices needed to design and deliver digital products. Beginning at a strategic level, Ian will then dive into tactics through real-world examples, highlighting the planning in delivery adjustments and unique challenges found in designing projects. A few announcements before we get started. Feel free to ask questions using the question interface in the webinar control panel, and we'll answer them as they come in, but also at the end. We also are recording this webinar, and it will be available to everyone on the call. I will now turn it over to Ian.
Great, thanks, Clark. So what I'd like to talk about today is really planning for design. And what I mean by that is the unique aspects of product design, projects and programs. So both building those teams and the plans that you need to as a product manager, and also delivering them within a program as a project manager. So I'd like to try to touch on really both roles, and I know we have some folks in the line that come from both of those sides of the delivery. So really, to start with, design is for people, and projects are about people. So that's really where I'd like to start the conversation today, which is to talk a little bit about people and how we build the product teams that we're designing with great people, and that really creates great products. Without that, the product design process can really can descend into just this chaotic blend of people, techniques, and outcomes. And so you really need to start with a strong team. And the quote that I always like to go back to, which is from Bill Evans. He was a pianist who worked with Miles Davis on the very famous Kind of Blue album. And this is one of the things that he had in the liner notes of that album, which is group improvisation is a challenge. Aside from the weighty technical problem of collecting coherent thinking, there's a very human, even social need for sympathy from all members to bend for the common result. And I'd like to talk about this because there are two aspects here that are really important when you're considering building your teams, building your product design teams, which is making sure that they're all collectively thinking and working as one, but also that there's sympathy and empathy for one another's the skills that they're bringing to the table, experiences that they're bringing to the product design process. And once you have those things in harmony, that's where great products really are built from. So to start, at a very base level, what people do you actually need? And our product design products that we've been running and that we've run with our clients and that we run internally are really made up of these common roles. Interaction designer, of course, focused on user behaviors and motivations. They typically lead the research. Visual designers are really look and feel. They're really defining that aesthetic for your product. The UI developer, builds it, really focuses on making it performant, building and designing for different devices and contexts. And then project management, of course, keeping it all together. I point out product manager here, and again, many of you on the phone are in that role currently. We've noticed that a lot of product managers actually grow up through these roles and actually become product managers from them. So they're bringing that experience to the product definition and delivery aspect of what they're doing because they were former interaction designers or former project managers, or in some cases they were business analysts working to define the technical aspects and translate the technical aspects of a design or of a product design. But really the product manager is the ultimate generalist. And I'll get into generalists in a minute here. They're the ones that, that they not only own the product backlog and roadmap, but they really are the ones that have to be great on both the critical thinking side and the design thinking side, or the right and the left brain. They're really the ones that make it all come together. So while that's important, they also need to be cognizant that they're building teams, both either hiring or working with project management to staff if in an internal consultancy arrangement or engagement model. They need to be able to staff teams filled with both generalists and specialists that really complement one another and that have both the critical thinking and the design thinking. And I'll go into that in a little bit. Ultimately, in terms of critical, design is really a mess. And in practice, it involves jumping forwards and backwards. There's a lot of different ideas that are generated. This particular drawing was by Jason Fried of Basecamp, and he uses this to articulate how an idea actually comes about. There's a post that he did last year, and I liked it because an idea doesn't just come about and you don't just run with it. It changes, and it requires both design thinking to really think through what are the questions you're trying to answer, and then critical thinking to really consider what are the constraints, how do we prioritize these particular ideas, what are more important than the other, what are the constraints that we're really putting on our product design process. And so you need a very cohesive team with unique roles in order to do that. And I'd like to talk a little bit about building that product design team and what are those unique roles that are kind of encompassed by the ones that I just mentioned. So really to start, we start with the specialist, and the specialist those are really the professionals that they have the time, the experience, and really the project experience, right? They've been through the trenches to allow them to go deep on any number of, into a particular discipline. So this could be, as a UI designer, it could be a particular facet of mobile design, for instance. It could be information architecture if they came from more of a UX background, or research. Typically we found that these roles, they start as generalists, and I'll talk about generalists in a minute. And they practice very broadly for many years, and then they start to focus on one particular thing, and they just become really great at that. The generalist is it's really the bedrock, of your product design team, and they're the ones that are really going broad rather than deep. But you can throw them many different problems. They're really the glue. They're the way that your product is actually delivered. So they're not only going to be touching on interaction design, IA. They could be helping you flesh out design thinking on a particular idea that you have. But they also could be doing project management. They could be jumping over and doing content analysis. So a lot of different things. They don't necessarily go deep on those areas, so they have to work very closely with those specialists. But you'll probably have more generalists, and those are really going to be the roles that are going to be driving the project forward, or the product forward. On the flip side, there's also the compartmentalist, and the compartmentalist typically isn't very good for teams. And it depends on the organization, but they are much different than the specialists in the fact that they aren't as flexible. They didn't necessarily grow up with breadth. They really focused on one particular thing, and they haven't really grown out of that one particular area that they're focused on. So it could just be a content manager or roles similar to that, where they haven't necessarily ascended into information architecture. What this particular role really needs is to be given more responsibility in some cases, or more opportunities to expand and to become more general, so they can add more value. It really starts to, the hindrance that these particular roles start to bring up is when there's limited work. It depends on the phase of the project, and when you need to shift from one aspect of the project to the next, or emergencies come up, that's when their value starts to get diminished, because they can really only do one thing. So you need to help these particular roles broaden their skill sets. So here I just wanted to, and again, these are some of the things that we found with in delivering our projects and some of the roles that we're delivering them for. Generalists, usually they naturally evolve into being specialists. Really give compartmentalists more challenges and see if they can handle it. And then from there, you're gonna grow that bedrock of your product design team. The specialists ultimately make your product special. The generalists ultimately make your product happen. So those two groups are really going to be working very closely together. So finally, in closing, really partner with specialists. And the reason why I recommend this is Specialists have, they tend to be expensive. Unless you have someone working internally in your organization, or if you're really trying to innovate, you're trying to break free, you're trying to bring in practices from the outside, which we see commonly. Specialists tend to be expensive to hire. They tend to be really difficult to identify even in the market because they're in such high demand. And it can be a really time-consuming endeavor. So relying on design partners to provide this kind of expertise and embed those partners, those specialists within your teams, so that they can soak up knowledge and understand new techniques in the market, understand new tools, is a great way to both continue to innovate your product, but also to grow your team. Generalists are really, in terms of having that broad knowledge and techniques, they're the ones you're definitely going to look to hire. And compartmentalists, as I've mentioned, you're really looking to give challenges and really try to grow so that they can become broader and more valuable to your teams. So we've talked a little bit about the makeup of teams and the roles, and a little bit about partnering. And so I'd like to go into engagement models. And what I mean by this is both with internal consulting groups or external design and development partners. Creating flexible and effective engagement models is really going to help, both juice your product, allow you to innovate, allow you to get something to market faster. And one thing you have to consider before really starting this, which is you can't necessarily predict what that product is going to be. So before jumping into a partnership, to an engagement model with an internal partner or an external partner, it's really helpful to start to at least consider before doing that the product at the beginning, or the product that you go into this engagement with, is not going to be the one that's delivered. So because of that, you really need to be focusing on flexibility and developing flexible engagement models, because ultimately there's so much uncertainty with your product. It depends on where you are with it, of course. If you're just starting and it's a fledgling idea or group of ideas, the uncertainty is very high. As you start to really whittle those ideas down, validate them with research, validate them against your customers' needs, against where you want to be in the market, obviously that uncertainty goes down. But ultimately, you need to be looking to share risk with external partners rather than just offloading it, because you're really not offloading it. You're looking to work with an external partner to help to prioritize your backlog, and then really adjust through that process of prioritizing, and through developing flexible engagement models. And what I mean by this really is not necessarily fixing all of the aspects of a particular contract, or a particular model of working together, so that there is flexibility to allow design partners to work with you work through ideas with you, to adapt to things that happen naturally along the course of a project or along the yellow brick road. There are a lot of different things that are going to come up that you can't necessarily foresee. You can't look into that crystal ball and see. And if you fixed everything, it's really difficult to be flexible and to really adapt, because ultimately you're in it together. And so when you've decided to go into outsource some of the work that you need, or really try to augment your team, you're really saying that you're looking to share risk, and you're acknowledging that sharing risk is important, or at least the acknowledgement of it is important to developing strong collaborative relationships with those partners. So talking just a little bit more about fixed, really that's with those partners, it's tricky to have a fixed scope contract when you're doing product design work. Fixed scope contracts assume that you know exactly what your product's going to be, and there isn't going to be change. You've done enough diligence up front to really develop a good product requirements document, to understand your customers through and through, and you're really just bringing a spec to bear so that a internal or external partner can really deliver it. But that's also not acknowledging that things are in fact going to change. In many ways, fixed contracts also pit client against partner in a way that you're not necessarily working together, but you're just trying to mitigate one another's risk. rather than share risk and actually move forward in such a way. Agile continues to become more and more adopted within the enterprise, and we're seeing year-over-year increases, at least according to Gartner and Forrester, that Agile adoption is as a philosophy is being taken on not only in the IT groups and the marketing groups, but also in design, where we've seen it be a little tricky to implement, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But Agile and fixed just don't necessarily work well together. When you're fixing all of your constraints, you can be flexible, you can embrace change, and that's really why that's where Agile has become more adopted, because more and more enterprises are saying, we're getting burned on these projects, 75% of them are failing, and we've finally faced up to the reality that, particularly with design projects, where you don't necessarily know what the end game is going to be, what the end product is going to be, we need to be able to be more flexible. And that's primarily one of the reasons why Agile Agile's adoption continues to increase. That said, when you're looking at the constraints on a project of scope, time, people, really, or of budget, you still need to consider for contingency budget. And so typically we advise both clients and also internal project groups or product groups that if you're setting off down a course of having a product that's in the market, that's fairly well known, that has a well-developed roadmap and strategy, you still need to really be considering 10 to 15% of your budgetary spend for contingency. In the case that when things change, when change orders are needed, when you learn something about your product that's important enough that you need to make a considerable change to how you're doing it. With greenfield or new products, something that's really potentially new to market, might even be changing your business, I would increase that contingency to 20 to 25%. Now, a couple of notes on this: these budgets should in fact be separate from your program budget. It shouldn't necessarily be a slush fund that you just dip into during the course of a budget. It still requires requests and approvals. So we've seen this, and again, continue to advise at least clients on this because it's been helpful down the road, and it alleviates some of that stress that we have when we're going through, we're learning something new, and we actually have to have a change. So we've got a team and a model. Now what? The techniques that we're really looking at, and there's so many of them, but what are the techniques that your team focuses on? What do they use in order to really understand more about the product, more about what you're actually trying to deliver, and how you're trying to validate product ideas? And there are a lot of choices, and you definitely have to choose wisely, because you can go down a specific path if you've just chosen a technique because you're good with it, but you're not exactly considering what the outcomes are. And that really should be the driver for what technique you're choosing. So for instance, if you're ideating for a particular product, you probably have a ton of different ideas. You don't necessarily, the majority of those ideas are going to get thrown out. Therefore, you need to be focused on speed. You need to be focused on something that you're really competent with. Everybody can whiteboard, everybody can sketch, everybody can draw something. And so really, those particular techniques are really helpful when you're just jotting down ideas. They're also temporal in nature. And so you can quickly go through a series of ideas with a whiteboard session, throw a couple out, move a couple on into more of a validation stage where you do a little bit of user testing. You might even do some surveys to understand more about that particular idea. Moving on to design, again, as you're going through this path, you're really saying, okay, the certainty of my particular product idea is starting to decrease, the certainty is starting to increase. And as the certainty increases, so too does the fidelity of the output or the work product that I'm trying to create. So, we're trying to get towards a point where we can really hone in on that experience, but you really need to validate that idea beforehand. So when you're doing that ideation and that validation, you really need to be focusing on speed and low fidelity. In general, I would say focus start with what are the tools and the techniques that your team is most comfortable with. I've seen product teams that can just bust out stuff in Photoshop, And that's just that is just how they want to do wireframing, for instance. That's how they want to do annotations. If that's what they're most competent with, if that's how they can move the fastest, then stick with that. I would really choosing that and competency over taking on a more complex tool or more complex technique, and not really considering the outcomes, but just considering the fidelity by which the work product's going to be. This is going to be a really amazing comp. It's going to completely outline everything we think we need, but we haven't really validated a lot of these things. So we're going to spend all this time on a comp that we haven't, for ideas that we haven't exactly sussed out. So a lot of wasted effort, a lot of wasted budget potentially. And so you really need to be focused on speed. And again, speed allows you to validate ideas quicker, get feedback quicker, and really learn more. And that's what you're trying to do in beginning stages of your product design process. And then, until really that product is validated, and the risk is acceptable to both you and your team, and then you start to refine that experience. And so, typically we recommend to, again, start low fidelity to validate. And then you're going to need to naturally increase the fidelity of a particular prototype or work product as you want to learn more about the uniqueness of that product experience. And then, of course, on to production. And interesting enough, the Nielsen Group did a study on what techniques this was in 2015, a study on what techniques are most commonly used, and static wireframes are most common. And this is interesting because it really speaks to the generalist. The generalist can usually handle a static wireframe. It's generally easy to understand, it's easy to implement. Annotations and going through interaction design. Once you start to get into, so again, that's really on the low fidelity side, you're really starting to plan out kind of what that interaction design is going to be. But once you start to get into testing, once you start to get into really nailing down and getting feedback, that's really where you're going to be increasing that fidelity to more of an interactive prototype. So the Nielsen study also found that interactive is the most effective. And so both with selling a product idea internally to management, using third-party vendors where you're trying to communicate a design, or internal developers and engineers where you try to communicate requirements. It's easy to translate something when it's on a device, when it's within a context that you understand, you can actually interact with it. But ultimately, this leads up to one deliverable. So we're putting together all these work products in our product design process, but they're still just work products. They're really in service to that one deliverable. What's that product that you're going to be shipping to the market? You're not shipping a series of static wireframes. You're not shipping a research report or a customer journey map. You're shipping that product that all those things are really in service to. And so that still needs to be the focus. And so, we continue to downplay this idea of what are the deliverables that we're going to be shipping. It's really what is the product we're going to be shipping. And the deliverables you should be spending really only as much time as you need to on developing this particular work products. So what's the plan? So we've talked a little bit about the creation of a team, the different roles and how they're playing together, what particular techniques and what outcomes you're trying to drive with that particular team. But ultimately, you need to know what that plan is, how you're going to actually be delivering that design plan. And having, again, that solid and flexible team and engagement model that gives you room to learn and really focus on what that deliverable is, you still need to consider, what exactly do you know about your product? It's the question you should be asking yourself before you dive into that next project, the next product design project. That question is going to be bringing up the next activity of really nailing down what those assumptions are of your product, depending on where it is in its life cycle, or depending on what new features you're trying to add to it, or if you're trying to pivot the product entirely. It's what are the assumptions, and then really what are the questions we're trying to ask ourselves about the product. And that's really going to dictate what that upfront research plan is going to be, and then what that upfront testing is going to be. And this is referencing a lot of pillars from Lean UX, which Cantina has been practicing for a couple of years now, and we've seen a lot of benefits from that. which is really going away this notion of we know exactly what the product's going to be up front, instead turning it on its head and saying we actually don't know what the product's going to be, or we have a notion of what it is, but we're really trying to ask ourselves more questions, because from those we'll get better ideas and we'll decrease risk. And that's really what we've been focusing a lot on, decreasing the risk of spending a lot of time on a work product that's not really hitting the mark. And so a couple of things that we do or recommend up front, which is you can research. There's so many different research tools out there to really understand the market, understand your users, understand competitive products, understand product placement, but you need to time box that still. You still need to give it, in terms of budgeting and in terms of the actual plan, once you give it a good constraint and you have the tools and the partnerships in place, and I'll talk about that in a bit, then you can really continue to stay on track. Again, the product assumptions and hypotheses should really be the guide towards what that product's ultimately going to be. Everybody needs to be working together. So going back to talking about the different roles within the product group, the UX designer, the visual designer, the project manager, they all need to be working together really in a particular phase. So we've been going more back to, with our clients, breaking down phases. So while we have a phased approach to different projects, we actually are working cohesively as a group, not only with a client and with their customers, but also bringing in a UI developer, for instance, to do research along with a UX designer. And what that does is that imbues the UI developer with the understanding of what the actual customer needs. They're not doing any UI development, so that's a specialist that's not actually doing they're not actually focusing on their specialty. They're focusing on something they generally know how to do, which is research, but they're getting a better understanding of what that product is ultimately going to be and what they're implementing, so that when they're in development, they're asking less questions of the client, less questions of the customer, less questions of the UX designer, because they can just go. They already know what we've learned, and it's a more cohesive way of learning and of developing the product itself. And that really speaks back to real-time communication tools, and this highlighted mostly with distributed teams, developing products on more of an international scale, which we've done, focusing on tools such as Skype and Slack, chat tools, certainly video chat, really trying to do away with that static report, the weekly report, and really focusing on what are the things that we need to talk about today, and what are we focused on getting to in terms of goals, and leveraging the new technologies that are coming out and that continue to come out. So everybody needs to be together, because everybody needs to land at the same time, and they all are working towards the same goal. So really taking away that notion of, the UI designer developing a static wireframe and then throwing it over the wall to the visual designer, who's going to then throw it over the wall to the developer. That whole flow, that workflow, is just, all you're doing is just increasing the risk of translation issues, of not really understanding what the product's going to be, and ultimately it's just waste. And so really focusing on keeping the groups together and keeping them coherent. So to that point, again, siloed working, big reveals is again kind of an old notion that's going away, which is putting together a big comprehensive design, spending a lot of time in a vacuum with the team, and then revealing it to an internal or external party or even management. It just increases the risk that you're not going to necessarily hit the mark. So instead, we like to bring in clients into our actual projects, so that we can show them the dirty work, because design, again, is a mess. It's not something that's clean. You're not just dealing with really nice looking comps and really nice looking annotations. It's, you're learning new stuff, you're making a lot of mistakes, as you're making those mistakes, you're learning more. And I think, as both internal and external parties start to get involved in all of that, you reduce the amount of miscommunication, and you only increase the amount of togetherness as a team, and you're really developing that product. So just a couple of examples. We recently did a marketing site redesign for a 1B plus tech vendor. So a couple of things we learned from this is we did actually too much research, and we didn't focus enough on screening. Really understanding, okay, we had a notion of who the people we were trying to identify, but we still didn't screen them well enough. So therefore, we had to do a lot more research than we probably did, and it elongated the project plan. We didn't put those constraints in to the project plan, and that's really where that recommendation comes from. So again, put a constraint on your research, focus on what are the questions you're trying to ask and who are you trying to ask, and develop a really solid screener to get those customer interviews. And then you can actually spend more time with testing and validating those ideas and less time with just doing that upfront research. Also did a recent marketplace design for a $600 million e-commerce company. Interesting findings here were the design team was always staying one sprint ahead. So again, we put a constraint on design, which is challenging because again, going back to that left and right brain thinking, we're kind of putting a constraint on the design thinking, on that right brain thinking. And we had to work with this challenge, but by putting that constraint on, that meant that the development team constantly had stuff to work on. We only took on hypotheses that we felt we could prove out and test in a week's time. And therefore, we were able to stay one step ahead. We were actually able to integrate the design team within the agile process of the development team. But most importantly is plan advance for testing. Testing continues to be one of those things that, and I think with the design becoming more and more important within enterprises and industries, actually researching and testing with customers and with users is also likewise becoming more justified within project plans and budgets. That said, you have to plan for it up front. It should be part of project initiation steps, and it needs to be something that's considered because it tends to be the largest drag on a particular product design engagement. It can take a lot of time if you don't necessarily have the right partnership set up, or if you haven't planned for testing properly. So I would say give it weeks in advance to do that, either usability testing or survey design or customer interviews. All those things tend to take time because you're effectively significantly augmenting the amount of stakeholders in your project when you're doing that. But there are a lot of services out there that can help, and that's the great part. Because of the rise in how important design is and how important research is, because research is so integral to design, there are so many different services out there, both on the user testing side, and these are some of the services that Cantina is used with clients, and even voice of the customer, which are really more investments, I would say, on the customer or the enterprise side, but it allows it allows you to stay closer to your customer. It also allows you to create small user testing groups within those relationships. So community space to an OC space, Medallia, they do this really well. They're small research groups, you learn a lot about your product, and this is really helpful for product design projects where you can just tap right into those groups and ask questions and test. So just to wrap up here, and I wanted to make sure that we had time for questions. Build a team of specialists and generalists. They're really going to be the bedrock of your team. They're going to be the ones that are going to help you innovate and help you design something that's really going to make a market in the market. And that said, make sure that while compartmentalists can be a drag on products and design teams, they also need to be challenged. They need to be grown so they can become generalists. Flexible engagement models with both internal and external partners is going to be considering really how we do design. There's the old notion of the waterfall process where you develop a product requirements document up front and you know exactly what your product's going to be at the end. It's just an old notion. Things are moving way too fast in technology, and we need to be able to move with them. Have a contingency budget, 10 to 15% if you have a known product and you have a high degree of confidence that you know ultimately what that product's going to look like. Greenfield or new products, 20 to 25% to start with. Choose design techniques based on the questions that you're trying to answer about your product. And then finally, as much as you can within your particular organizations, get people sitting together. on design projects. If they can't sit together, ensure that that they're using real-time communication, that they're meeting daily. A week is just a weekly product status report is too long. Things move too fast. You learn a lot in a week. A week's actually a fair amount of time. So ensure that everyone's working together, both on the IT side, on the design side, and the marketing side. Embrace Agile is a broad philosophy for organizations to embrace. That said, there are tenets that can be fairly easily implemented as it's grown and as it's accepted. And one of those is communication and daily communication.
Great. Thank you so much, Ian. You covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. So we'll open it up to questions. And again, if you have a question that you want to ask, put it in the question chat window and we'll make sure to cover it. A couple have come in, and so if we have time, I'd love to ask them. Sure. Great. So you mentioned that there's kind of two different types of people. There's the specialists and generalists. One person is asking, is the way you manage them different?
Yeah, great question. In my experience, the specialists need to be challenged. They're either the best in their field. They know all of the most common techniques, design patterns. They may have come from a product design background or a UX background. So if the challenges aren't there for them, they're going to get bored and they're going to get complacent, and they may even regress back into being a generalist because they need to start helping out with different other aspects of the product design process because their particular specialty isn't required at that time. So I would say keep them challenged and ensure that when you're actually staffing a project or when you're hiring for a particular product that you know exactly what you're trying to achieve.
Great. Another question just came in, and this is about those outputs that you mentioned, mood boards. One person was asking about, because there's so many, how do you know which one is the right fit for the project?
Sure. It's really all about what you're trying to, what are you trying to learn, really, in a particular stage about your product or about your product idea. So on the visual design side, mood boards can be great in terms of learning about what the aesthetic of the actual design is going to be, what the visual aesthetic, the look and feel is going to be, and doing that in a more measured way so that you're not actually going out and creating a fully fledged, beautiful looking comprehensive design in Photoshop that's, just absolutely pixel perfect. That takes time, it takes effort, and it also, unless you have a good notion of that the risk is decreased, the certainty is increased on what you know about your product, it can be a risky endeavor. A mood board can just pull together all different aspects of what the look and feel could be in a fairly short amount of time. So on the visual design side, I would say it depends on the questions that you're trying to answer about your particular product. UX, it's really if you're going broad and you're trying to define kind of what the experience could be, that's really that's questions. That's getting into a room with a lot of people and just doing some whiteboarding exercises. Out of that conversation, once you start to really hone in on, hey, you know what, if we're redesigning a top-level navigation, for instance, we have some questions about the IA. We know we're doing these things wrong. We've identified them. Okay, so let's go in and then do some tree testing. Let's go in and really focus on the particular IA of the top-level navigation, test it with users, and validate some of the guesses really that we're making right now. So it's really a matter of what are your big questions, and then what are the tools and techniques that you can use that you're most competent with, that you can get the fastest answers from, so that you can save that time and use it when you really are, when the risk on your product knowledge has been mitigated, and you really know that you're making smaller bets on things.
Great. That was a great question from our participants. So we'll just wrap up here. A little bit about Cantina. We're a Boston-based digital design agency. We've been founded in 2007, and we have about 60 employees in the Seaport area. And if anyone is interested in learning more about us or like to work with us, feel free to reach out to us on social media, as well as hello@cantina.co. So I do want to thank everyone who's on the line for spending your Thursday morning with us. If you did miss any parts of the presentation or you want to go back and review, we will be posting the recording as well as Ian's slide to our website. And our website is cantina.co, C-O at the end. It usually takes us about a week to get them up there, but an email will be sent to everyone letting you know when they are available. We hope that you'll join us for our next webinar happening in February. We will send an invitation out to everyone in a couple weeks. Have a wonderful day, and thank you again for taking the time to participate with us.